Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about writing, editing, publishing, literature, the arts, and more. I am Ito Utini.
And I'm Makaya Utini, and today we're speaking with Dipika Mukherjee. Dipika is a writer and traveler. She teaches at StoryStudio Chicago and the Graham School of the University of Chicago, writes a literary column for the Edge of Malaysia, and has published 8 books of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. She's currently working on a 3rd novel and a hybrid memoir. We're delighted to be with her today. First-time listeners, welcome. We're glad you're here. We're building a community of writers and artists from all walks of life, and since you're with us on this journey, we'd appreciate if you would like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and spread the word. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover, or a guest you want us to bring on, please let us know, and for more free resources, check out the Date Keepers blog at thedatekeepers.com/blog. Thank you.
Dipika, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you. Can you please tell us about you and your work?
Yes. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm just so glad to be here today. I am a sociolinguist by academic training, but I have kind of ventured into writing fiction as well as poetry. And my last book was a collection of essays. So I guess I kind of dabble in all kinds of genres. And my work is very transnational because I have lived in many different countries and worked there. So although I write primarily in English, I do tend to also mix up languages, especially in my poetry.
That's a lot of fun.
What languages do you mix up?
Okay, my mother tongue is Bengali, which is, I think it's got the 7th largest number of speakers in the world. And then I also speak Hindi as a native speaker, and I read and write both of these languages. English is like really the language that I'm the strongest in now because it's my language of academics as well as my work. And I'm very conversant in Malay.
Oh, wow. I've been to Malaysia, and you're joining us from Malaysia today. How is the weather over there? We're in the States. A lot
Yeah.
of people are now experiencing the winter. How is it over there in Malaysia?
It is always, well, we have 3 seasons, hot, hotter, and hottest. So, right now, I'd say that we're pretty comfortable because it rains pretty much every day, but it's not quite the monsoon, very, very heavy rains. It's a very pleasant, balmy time right now.
So, did you pursue the study of sociolinguistics because that interested you, or was that just the path that was open to you, and then you found your way into literature, and that's your real passion?
Yeah, actually, that is kind of a really interesting question because my path to it was not very straightforward. What happened was I did my bachelor's as well as my master's degrees in straightforward English literature from India, from New Delhi. So when I basically got funding to do a PhD in Texas, I was going to go there and pursue a PhD in British theater. And, once I was there for 1 semester, I realized that I really didn't want to do more literature. And I had a really interesting class in sociolinguistics, and I had classes in Old English, which for some reason just fascinated me because I thought that I would sort of flunk out of Old English, but that there are a lot of common words with Sanskrit. So even almost like I don't want to say that I didn't have to work hard. I did have to work hard initially, but I felt that a lot of the linguistics parts just came very naturally. And I was fascinated by sort of the scientific underpinnings of language, of, how they are so grammar based and rule based. Whereas studying literature had been a little more, what should I say? Sometimes there are really no rules. So I just kind of fell in love with sociolinguistics, and I ended up sort of teaching it for many, many years. And I've always loved teaching sociolinguistics and linguistics in various countries. And honestly, there were just more jobs when I graduated in linguistics than there were in just English literature.
Like you, I write in English and I think and speak English every day now because I don't as much use other languages. But I've been always asked, why do I write in English? So, why do you write in English instead of other languages? Earlier, you mentioned that you prefer English. Why is that? Like, why English instead of your mother tongue or your other languages?
Yeah. Well, I think that it probably would have happened even if I had lived in India because, colonialism, right? I mean, English became the language that gave people status and upward mobility. So when I was growing up as a child, it was pretty clear that my parents were going to have us all educated in English just so that we ended up with better jobs. But the other thing that I think changed the trajectory of my life is that my father is a diplomat. So ever since I was like 6 months old, I've been sort of traveling the world. And English was actually the only language that was readily available to a diplomatic family. And of course, it's a lingua franca now. Like wherever you go, the schools are just they're in English. So yeah, for me, it was I was always educated in international schools, and therefore the language of academics was always English. And although I read and write Hindi and Bengali, I don't read it as fluently as I do English. So that is, I guess, my answer. I wish I had more fluency in Bengali, but, unfortunately, I think it's just going to be harder for me to write in Bengali.
And how about your audience? When we write, we think about our audience, we think about our readers. Do you think about your readers when you make that choice to write in a certain language?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I come up against this all the time because my first novel, for instance, was a very socio-political novel that was based in Malaysian politics. And obviously, I had a very Malaysian audience in mind when I was writing that because the politics of that time, I felt, silence is never neutral. And all we can do as writers is to bear witness. And when this book came out in 2011, at that time, Malaysia did have an extremely corrupt prime minister. And when I was writing it, I obviously had all these allusions to things that were happening. But because of the self censorship and just general banning of books that goes around here, I couldn't be very direct about it. So when I read that book, when I read aloud at events in Malaysia, I did not have to do anything to gloss over all the terms and things I was talking about. People instantly knew that if a model was being blown up in the fields of Shah Alam, who she was and what the whole story was. Whereas if I was going to read, and I have read from this around the world, in America especially, people don't really know about Malaysia very much. It's not on their radar the way that, say, Vietnam is, or even Saudi Arabia. So it was a much harder sell almost to get people to be interested in the book. And when I was publishing it, for sure, I was not able to get an American publisher because even the agents would say things like it was too political for America. But I didn't really know what's too political for America. I think they meant that the politics were too foreign for America, but they just couldn't say that.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about each of your books?
Yeah, sure. I actually have written, I think it's about 8 books now, but three of my I have written, two novels. The first one is Ode to Broken Things, which is set in Malaysia, the book that I just spoke about. The second one is Shambhala Junction, which is about how child trafficking rings around the world work through international adoptions, but it's told as a sort of a love story, and it has a central character who goes to India, gets lost on a railway station, and then gets involved with the child trafficking ring. So my books tend to be sort of like socio-political rather than just love stories. And I've written one collection of short stories, which is a compilation of stories that are set around the world. Again, they usually have something to do with a social issue or the politics of that place. I've written one collection of short stories, which came out in 2022. And then my latest book is called Writer's Postcards, which is a collection of essays, travel essays. And that was published by Penguin Singapore in 2023, and it came out in America in 2024. So again, my books they cover a lot of different places and characters, but I think they are all about sort of what history is silent about, and how like the lives of women, the displaced, the unlettered are kind of absent from our archives. And I just try to find things that interest me, but I just do not have a lot of knowledge about. So it's curiosity as well as, if I say that I want to give voice to the unvoiced, that just sounds pompous. But I think sometimes I just find a story that is just so interesting, but it hasn't been covered very much. So just to give you an example, I'm working on a collection of short stories right now. And one of the stories in there, the collection is titled based on this short story. And Pablo Neruda, the very, very famous poet, the much lauded poet, in his autobiography, talked about raping his Ceylonese maid when he was a consul in Sri Lanka in the 30s or even earlier. And he just sort of described it in his memoir because he knew it wouldn't be a big deal. He got away with it. And I read about all that and I was thinking, oh my God, this poor woman, this horrible thing happened to her and nobody talks about it. Of course, Chilean women have been talking about it, and they protested so much that the airport in Chile was not named after Pablo Neruda, but after a woman, a writer. But in general, the world is pretty much still sort of prostrating at his feet. And I just wanted to write from the point of view of this woman who was in Sri Lanka working as his domestic help and had to endure this. So again, I try to sort of find the silences in history and see what that speaks to.
Well, that's why fiction is good. I always say in fiction is where actually we can say that we can be a voice for the voiceless, because those characters are not here and they're just mostly imaginary. But yeah, congrats on your success in publishing. Can you talk about that journey of publishing? What challenges, if any, you faced? And yeah, if you can share your publishing experience with our audience.
Yeah, I teach right now at the Graham School at the University of Chicago, which again, is a very different kind of group to be talking about publishing and experiences. Because when we live in America, we are absolutely privileged to have like so many places that are open to publishing. And there's like a whole large number of literary magazines and online magazines and things that you can submit to. Now, before I went to America and I was, say, trying to publish from Malaysia or Singapore, and before the internet kind of developed to what it is today, it was extremely hard to find people who would want to publish work in English sometimes, or sometimes, just people who wanted to publish your work full stop. So I think that my publishing journey has been very much shaped by where geographically I've been. And my novels have both been published first in the UK because, again, the United Kingdom, because of colonialism, just knows Asia better. So the UK publishers as well as agents were much more open to the kinds of books I was writing. And in America, I sometimes felt that there was a kind of more of a demand for these migration stories, the assimilation, narrative. And I wasn't writing those kinds of narratives. I was kind of writing about Asia, about people coming to Asia or being in Asia and finding themselves and changing the community that they're in. So I think that initially there was quite a lot of resistance. It took me a while to publish my first novel. I was in my early 40s when that happened, but I have had like short stories published here and there. So, depending on where I'm teaching creative writing, I sometimes make that very clear that now, because the world is sort of open to writers, they shouldn't just submit work to where they are geographically, but try to just send it out to places that seem to be publishing their kind of work. And it has become a lot easier, I have to say. And especially when I started publishing, I think, a couple of decades ago, there was this trend to do this Indian woman story, slap a cover on with a woman in a sari, with a bare shoulder looking back, and just sell it as a narrative that's exotic and palatable. But I think as I've lived and worked and published in America, I'm realizing that even the kinds of work that we are writing as Asians or as women is allowed to be more nuanced. And I think that's a good thing. I'm glad that the room is getting a lot wider and people have an appetite, or rather there's a whole bunch of like smaller independent publishers who are welcoming voices that are not so mainstream.
One thing that I think is driving all of this is, of course, the media. I am a former journalist, and whatever is trending is whatever the publishers are trying to seek, because, work that is trying to bring about some changes in the world, or that is different, that the audience is not familiar with, is hard to sell. And I don't blame publishers. I always think about the readers, the audience, what they want. And as human beings, we like stories that have happy ending. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
whether the person is Indian, or in my case Moroccan, or
Yeah.
wherever you come from. If you have a story where, whether fiction or nonfiction, there is more inspiration, because people don't feel comfortable to face real life when you have a character that is still facing challenges, or you're talking about real life issues. It's hard for readers, because a lot of readers want to read to escape their own real
Yeah.
miserable life experiences.
Yeah, that's true. But yes, I think again, then, we're getting into the question of whether people read for just sheer escapism, or whether they read for erudition, or whether they read for empathy. There are very many reasons why people would read. But I think, yes, absolutely. And especially in these times, my God, when there's so much awful stuff that's, hitting you every single day on the news. I mean, I don't blame people at all for just wanting escapism in their reading or in whatever they're watching on TV. I mean, the world is just so horrible that, of course, you want to get away from all this bleakness and doom.
And speaking of reading, who are you reading and who would you name as your literary influences, and how do you approach them as a reader first and also as an author?
Yeah, I read anything, and everything. And I am falling in love with Korean writers. In terms of English writing, let me think. I really enjoyed Yellowface recently because of, just this commentary on publishing in the West. Margaret Atwood's The Blind Assassin is a book that I absolutely adore and I teach as well because I just find the braided narrative so interesting. Similarly, for like Poisonwood Bible, I think I find like narratives that have multiplicity of voices and points of view fascinating. In terms of my own reading, I have kind of grew up with a lot of Bengali literary tradition because my father was a scholar in Bengali literature. And so I grew up with Rabindranath Tagore and Bankim Chatterjee and a lot of sort of revolutionary books that were about freedom and like women's emancipation and all kinds of things like that. So I would say that my literary heroes are actually quite diverse, and I have been just reading whatever I get my hands on, and I love it.
And this is a little bit of an aside, but I think it does also return to the transnational theme here. Earlier, you mentioned that you'd studied Old English and that you noticed a lot of cognates between Old English and Sanskrit. And I'm curious, are those cognates that are no longer they no longer show up in modern English, that they're only visible when you're looking at Old English? And can you talk a little bit more about what you found, if you have any examples that you can share that you happen to remember about that? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Basically, it's all this old Indo-European roots, right? So even now, for instance, if you look at sort of cognates, kinship terms, are of course very, very old in all cultures. So if you take a word like widow in English, the word is vidva in Indian languages even now, and it has the same root. Similarly, if the word brother, the word in Indian languages, including Hindi, Bengali, is brata in formal Bengali. And all of these are, from the same root. So like when I was studying Old English, there would be a passage about a deer in the forest. And the words would be like, the word for deer, I think it was something like mriga, if I remember correctly, which is, a Sanskrit term that's used now. So these sort of things just kept delighting me and astonishing me. I just ended up enjoying that course so much more than I initially thought I would, because when you first look at Old English, it just looks so inaccessible. But once you start sounding out the words, you're like, oh, wait a minute, I know this.
Yeah, and we always ask our guests to read, to share some of their work with our audience. Do you have anything that you would like to read?
Yes, I'd like to read from my latest book, which is actually a collection of essays, and it's titled Writer's Postcards. And I thought that I'd read from the beginning of the book so that, in a way, a lot of the questions that you've been asking me and my work as a writer is explained in these first few pages. So I'll begin.
Yeah, go
Yes,
ahead.
go ahead.
Solo travel encourages me to stop and wonder and craft that experience with words. It was my mother, after our worst fight, who let me give myself the permission to travel solo. We spat bitterly in Kolkata over something that now feels inconsequential, but at that time I took umbrage. I, who was supposed to stay on in Kolkata for another week, flew to Varanasi, the closest place I could think of at such short notice. Of course, I'd been on solo trips before, but they were academic conferences in places as far-flung as Lancaster and Cancun and Evora, where lectures on new discoveries in linguistics left little free time before networking over coffee meetings and mayoral receptions. Writing residencies came similarly prearranged, with artist statements outlining the time allocated against the words to be written. But in Benares, also known as Varanasi or Kashi, for the first accidental solo travel, I checked into a hotel and literally did not know what to do next. And this ancient city, one of the oldest living cities on our planet, unfurled to take in my rage and my grief and my petulance. I came to Varanasi incensed at the pettiness of our mother-daughter quarrel at a time when my father-in-law was seriously ill and a young nephew had been diagnosed with a debilitating disease. But in the morning calm of Varanasi, on a boat ride on the Ganges, the banks erupted in Achyutam Keshavam, my father-in-law's favorite religious hymn. Hearing this bhajan being sung by a group of singers at dawn, Benares has some of the oldest musical gharanas of India, felt like an epiphany. It felt as if I was being told that my father-in-law would survive, as indeed he did, for 9 more wonderful years. Varanasi, in so many ways, taught me to stop and revel in the pleasures of being alone. I stopped at the traditional Shakahari restaurant suggested by my rickshaw driver, went into an ancient Shiv shrine next to the burning carts, spoke at length to the artist at a gallery exhibition at the Benares Hindu University, and I fell in love with this city that had taught generations about death and life and how nothing is ever truly gone. As women, we spend so much time nurturing our ties and creating new life that the life of the mind is often stalled during the child nurturing years. It feels like freedom to be at an age where I can travel alone and enjoy that solitude. It is never easy. The ferry ticket seller, the shuttle bus driver, the receptionist all ask, with a mix of pity and wonder, if I'm really traveling alone. Sometimes a question is phrased as, "Do you not have any friends?" But then there is also the kindness of strangers, the solicitude extended to any woman traveling alone. Of course, I'm not the first woman to love my solitude, and as travel becomes safer and more affordable, women all around the world are embarking on journeys alone in thrilling and adventurous terrain. These words from a poem originally written by Mutta, an Indian woman who lived 2,600 years ago, and as translated by Uma Chakravarti and Kumkum Roy, resonate in my heart. So free am I, so gloriously free, free from 3 petty things, from mortar, from pestle, and from my twisted lord. Freed from rebirth and death I am, and all that has held me down is hurled away.
Thank you.
That was great.
Do you have anything else you would like to add?
Well, I think I talked about bearing witness, and I think it's just so important in this day and age for writers to just write about things and just start dialogues.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for making the time. We really enjoyed having you.
Thank you. It was great talking to you, Ito and Mikhail.
Thanks, Dipika. This has been great.
Okay. Bye.